Karen from the neighborhood association organized a wedding in my backyard, so I invited the local biker gang. The sun was just rising behind the Carolina pines when I pulled into the gravel driveway, exhausted after a 2-day fishing trip and smelling like catfish guts and pure stubbornness. I just wanted to take a shower, eat a slice of peach pie, and maybe take a quick nap in the hammock I had strung up between my old walnut trees. But when I rounded the house and looked at my backyard, I nearly dropped the bait cooler. My vegetable garden was gone. In its place stood a full-blown wedding altar, draped in white silk and fake roses, surrounded by rows and rows of white folding chairs. A string quartet was tuning their instruments under a makeshift canopy, and someone had set up a champagne bar where my tomato plants used to be. I stood there, stunned, my mouth hanging open like a busted mailbox. I either died in that lake, I muttered, or someone is getting married over my green beans. Just then, a young woman in matching lavender heels and dress rushed past, clutching a binder and shouting something about a 10-minute delay in the flower arrangements. She didn't even look at me. Several of my neighbors waved at me from their seats like I was the gardener. One of them, Greg, who lives 2 houses down, even asked if I could bring him a lemonade. I was too perplexed to respond. And then she appeared, walking with grandeur from behind the altar like she was the Queen of England. Cheryl Cranford, president of the neighborhood association, owner of a smile as fake as her eyelashes, and the type of woman who spoke as if every sentence deserved to be framed and hung in a rulebook. She wore a visor encrusted with rhinestones, a walkie-talkie clipped to her belt, and that deadly little clipboard clutched in her French manicured claws. "Oh Jake," she said in a cheerful tone, approaching as if everything were perfectly normal, "you're early. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." I stared at her in disbelief. "Cheryl, why is there a wedding in my backyard?" She blinked, like I'd asked her to explain gravity. "It's Ashley's big day, my daughter, remember? We needed a location with rustic charm and soft southern light. Your backyard has the perfect exposure. And my shed, my sprinkler system, and my damn vegetable garden." She waved it off with a gesture, like she was talking about squirrels. "Relax, we didn't touch your weird herbs. We just needed the space for the ambience. The photographer said the golden hour lights up your oak tree perfectly. You'll thank us when you see how it turns out. Just stay out of the frame, all right?" I don't remember walking away, but somehow I ended up on my porch with a bourbon in my hand and rage climbing up my spine like ivy on a brick wall. My entire backyard, my land, had been taken over like it was a public park. No notice. No request for permission. Just a full-blown invasion with catering, florists, and even a 12-piece wedding band showing up with amplifiers. I called the sheriff. They said it was a civil matter. I called the county office. They told me the property had been incorporated into the jurisdiction of the neighborhood association 10 years ago and that any dispute had to go through the association board. I called the board. Straight to voicemail. Cheryl had played her move, and I was the poor sucker who didn't even know I was on the board. Apparently, there was some obscure clause in the association's charter about shared communal space usage for special community events, and she had twisted it to justify taking over my easement. Privilege, she called it. I called it trespassing with a side of nerve. That night, as the rehearsal dinner echoed with clinking champagne glasses and fake laughter, I sat on the porch and watched my property be turned into a stage for people who wouldn't even look me in the eye. One of the guests asked if I was the gardener. Another handed me the keys to his BMW and asked if I could park it in the driveway. Cheryl just smiled and told everyone I was the local character. I smiled back and nodded. Because sometimes, when people mistake silence for weakness, they forget what a quiet man can do when he's angry. Around 10 o'clock at night, when the noise finally died down and Cheryl's army of wedding planners returned to their rental cars, I walked to the edge of my backyard and looked at the spot where my tomato plants used to grow. I thought about my wife, God rest her soul, and how she used to string up lights between those same trees for our anniversary dinners. How she loved this land, with all its wild edges, and how she always told me, when people cross your boundaries, don't yell, just build a better fence. Or invite bigger friends. I lit a cigar and took a long drag. The next morning, I put on my boots, grabbed my phone, and drove 15 minutes down Highway 9 to a place called the Rusty Sprocket. At first glance, it didn't look like much, just a bar restaurant with patched-up walls and a wire fence around a dusty lot full of motorcycles. But inside was the real America. These were my people. Bikers. Veterans. Misfits. Gearheads. Good folks with no patience for the pretentious nonsense of the neighborhood association. People who respected property lines and raised hell when those lines were crossed. I pushed open the door, nodded at the bartender, and raised my voice just enough. "I've got a backyard," I said, "and someone's throwing a wedding in it tomorrow. Without my permission. Anybody want to help me decorate?" Every head in the bar turned to me. And then, slowly, someone smiled. A woman with a mohawk and a vest full of patches leaned forward and asked, "You want it loud, funny, or unforgettable?" I smiled. "Why not all three?" They laughed. Someone slammed a beer bottle against the bar. Another guy, nicknamed Tiny, though he looked like he could lift a Harley, stood up and said, "Just tell us what time. We'll bring the fun." As I walked out of Rusty's Sprocket, the sun was cutting through the trees again. The golden hour, as Cheryl called it. She was right about one thing: my backyard was a beautiful place. But if she thought her daughter's wedding was going to be picture perfect, she hadn't counted on a choir of Harleys. And I was determined to make sure she regretted it. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cool, as if even the weather wanted front row seats for the chaos about to unfold. Birds chirped innocently in the trees bordering Michelle Acres, unaware that their peaceful morning was about to be drowned out by the guttural roar of engines. I sat on my porch sipping coffee, watching as white canopies were once again raised in my backyard. Cheryl's army of vendors had returned in full force: hairstylists, photographers, floral decorators, and a catering van that dared to park halfway across my garden without even knocking on my door. My property line meant nothing to these people. To them, my yard was just a rustic backdrop, and I was the old man they planned to crop out of the wedding photos. I didn't say a word as they ran around, adjusting flowers and barking orders into their walkie-talkies. I didn't need to. The gears of my plan were already turning. At the end of the street, a dozen motorcycles were being polished. Denim vests with patches were being dusted off, and boots were being freed from yesterday's grit. I'd given them simple instructions: show up at 2 o'clock sharp, dress like yourselves, and bring the noise. Meanwhile, Cheryl was in peak form, circling like a hawk, waving her clipboard in the air, headset clamped tightly on her head like she was directing a military operation instead of her daughter's wedding. I watched her stop the violinist mid-note to adjust the angle of the trill. She corrected the flower girl's steps 3 times. When she saw me, she flashed that tight Karen smile and called out, "Jake. We moved a few things, but don't worry, we left your shed untouched. If you could just stay inside during the ceremony, that'd be fantastic." I raised my mug. "No problem. Wouldn't want to ruin the aesthetic." She gave me a thumbs up like she'd just solved an international crisis, then vanished again into the crowd. I waited until she was out of sight and got to work. I went behind my shed and hooked up my outdoor speakers, the ones I usually use to play Johnny Cash records while mowing the lawn. But that day, Johnny would rest. That day, my speakers had something special lined up: Screaming Goat, dozens of sound clips, all bleeding in different tones and pitches. Just a bit of ambience to warm up the crowd before the real guests arrived. Around noon, the guests in pastel suits and floral dresses began to flood into my backyard, sipping champagne and pretending not to notice the faint scent of freshly turned earth beneath their dress shoes. They posed for photos in front of my oak tree, completely ignoring the private property sign that they had clearly hidden behind a potted hydrangea. I smiled and kept playing the polite fool. From time to time, I waved, and they waved back like I was part of the scenery. Exactly at 2 o'clock, a sound rumbled in the distance, a low thunder that grew by the second. Champagne glasses trembled. Cheryl looked up from her checklist, frowning. Then the first motorcycle appeared around the corner, followed by another, and then a dozen more entered in staggered formation, engines roaring like some beast had awoken in the woods. Men and women in black leather, chains, sunglasses, tattoos, one wore a Viking helmet, another had a parrot on his shoulder. A woman in a shirt that read "Born to be Tempered" rode side saddle, sipping iced tea like she was on her front porch. The guests stood frozen. Someone gasped. Cheryl dropped her clipboard. The motorcycles lined up along the edge of my property, their tires softly crunching the gravel. Not a single one crossed into the wedding area, everything was legal and gloriously loud. I stepped down from the porch and walked up to their leader, Big Mike, a giant of a man who once arm-wrestled a bear for charity and had the scars to prove it. He smiled and handed me the microphone connected to the speaker system. "Ready to start the show, Jake?" "Oh, I was born ready," I replied. I flipped the switch on my remote, and every speaker in the yard came to life, not with music, but with a synchronized chorus of screaming goats. The sudden cacophony of bleats startled everyone. The flower girl dropped her basket. The violinist threw down his bow. Cheryl clutched her chest like she'd been hit with a tranquilizer dart. People began murmuring and turning in confusion. Then, rising above the goat symphony, came the second wave, the biker choir, 20 voices belting out the most metal rendition of "Here Comes the Bride" ever heard in this part of Nashville. Electric guitars screamed from amplifiers hidden behind my shed. Drums thundered like a storm. A bald man with a ZZ Top-style beard screamed a solo so powerful that 2 doves fell out of a tree. Cheryl ran toward me, her heels tearing divots in my lawn, veil trailing behind her like a panicked ghost. "Hello. What do you think you're doing? This is a private wedding." I shrugged. "Not according to your easement clause. I'm just enjoying the shared aesthetic." She turned red, stammering something about noise ordinances and emergency complaints. "You're violating the sanctity of this event." "Oh," I said, "you mean like when someone takes over a man's backyard without permission and installs a mimosa bar next to his compost bin?" Her mouth opened, then closed. Cheryl turned to the sheriff, who had arrived after a noise complaint, but upon seeing the situation, he just tipped his hat to me and leaned against his cruiser with a grin. I stepped aside to let a group of bikers pass. One was carrying a tray of hot dogs, handing them out to the guests who seemed torn between horror and hunger. The kids laughed. The teens recorded everything on their phones. The guitarist, whom Cheryl's son-in-law tried to stop single-handedly, politely nodded and turned his amp up to 11. The climax came when one of the motorcyclists, formerly an opera singer and now a mechanic. She stepped forward and let out a high D note so sharp it shattered a champagne glass and brought the entire yard to silence. Even the goats fell quiet. Then came the applause from the back, first a sarcastic clap from one of the guests, then another, and finally laughter. Because once the madness had reached its peak, people couldn't help but embrace it. They took selfies with the bikers. The flower girl gave a high five to a giant tattooed man. Even the wedding photographer gave up and started taking action shots of the chaos. But Cheryl disappeared into her rental tent, yelling into her walkie-talkie like a general losing a war she thought she'd already won. Yet the wedding continued. Her daughter didn't even seem upset. In fact, she looked relieved that something real was finally happening in her so carefully scripted event. As the sun began to set, I stood by my walnut tree, arms crossed and heart pounding with satisfaction. The yard was a mess, but it was my mess. No one was ignoring me anymore. No one was pretending I didn't exist. And best of all, this circus was only getting started. The official ceremony was scheduled for 3 o'clock sharp. Cheryl had printed the programs herself, thick paper with gold lettering and floral borders that read, "The Crumpf-Tillman Union, a celebration of elegance." She even included a note about the gently curated southern ambience arranged by the neighborhood association. I found one tossed under a bush near the shed and used it to level the leg of my rocking chair. By then, the guests had either adapted to the absurdity or stopped resisting it altogether. Some even began to enjoy themselves. The bikers had taken over my driveway, grilling ribs on a portable barbecue, offering cold sweet tea, and playing darts with old spark plugs. The kids were in heaven. Their parents feigned horror, but more than one asked for extra ribs and laughed when they thought no one was looking. When the time for the ceremony came, Cheryl emerged from the bridal tent like a thundercloud wrapped in chiffon. Her eyes were locked on me as she crossed the lawn, heels so sharp they tilled the soil beneath them. Behind her, her daughter Ashley, the actual bride, followed nervously in a dress that looked more like a prom gown than a wedding gown, holding a bouquet the size of a watermelon. The string quartet, visibly traumatized from earlier events, tried to summon the courage to return to their positions. Cheryl stopped just at the edge of my property and hissed, "Jake, I am issuing you a formal cease and desist." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? You going to file that with the ribs or with the goat chorus?" "This is harassment," she snapped. "You are intentionally disrupting a legally sanctioned event." "No, ma'am," I replied, calm as a breeze. "I'm just having a peaceful gathering on my own land." "You said we shared ambience. I thought we were collaborating." She glared at me, nostrils flared like a spooked mule. "You're going to regret this. We'll fine you into the ground." I took a sip of my lemonade and gave her the kind of smile that used to make men nervous back in my Navy days. "Cheryl, if I had $1 for every person who underestimated me, I could have bought this entire subdivision and turned it into a goat sanctuary." Right then, another dozen motorcycles rolled in, parking with precision along one side of the yard. The riders dismounted with the ease of churchgoers arriving for Sunday service. One of them, a guy named Diesel, unfolded a drum kit and began warming it up again. He handed out fake mustaches to the flower girls. I glanced at the guests, most of whom had left their chairs to watch the spectacle. Laughter echoed. Someone shouted, "This is better than Netflix." The ceremony was supposed to begin, but Cheryl was too busy shrieking into her phone, trying to get the neighborhood association board to join an emergency Zoom call. Her husband Daryl, a man as bland as a wet sponge, stood at the altar holding a folder, looking like he wished he could disappear into the lawn. Ashley, the bride, looked more and more unsure of herself as the crowd split its attention between her and the guy juggling beer cans by the grill. Then, the unexpected happened. Ashley walked up to me. At first, she just stood silently next to my chair, bouquet trembling in her hands. I looked up, ready for a fight or a plea. But instead, she asked, "Mr. Michel, can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Shoot. Is it true that you built the swing on that tree? The one the kids are using now?" "Yes. About 30 years ago. I used to push my son on it every Sunday before church." She looked down at the grass. "I didn't want any of this. The tents, the photographers, the matching chair covers. I just wanted to get married without feeling like a show horse." I tilted my head. "Then why let your mother turn this into a circus?" She sighed. "Because she's been planning it since I was 10. And she always gets what she wants. Only if people let her." There was a long silence between us. Then she smiled, a small, genuine smile. "You're kind of a legend in this neighborhood," she said. I chuckled. "Well, legends usually come with a warning label." Without another word, she turned toward the crowd, pulled off her veil, and tossed it over her shoulder. It landed on the grill with a sizzle. The bikers erupted in cheers. Cheryl shouted something about pollution and collapsed into a lawn chair. Ashley walked up to her fiancé, took his hand, and said, "Let's get married under the walnut tree. That swing's a better backdrop anyway." And that's exactly what they did. They moved the whole ceremony 15 feet over, onto my land, outside the bounds of Cheryl's precious neighborhood association jurisdiction. The officiant, one of the bikers dressed head to toe as Elvis for reasons I never asked about, conducted the wedding with sincerity and just the right touch of theatrics. The bride and groom said their vows barefoot on the soil, smiling from ear to ear. The guests applauded. The goats bleated. Even the string quartet joined in, improvising a bluegrass version of the wedding march. Cheryl said nothing. She just sat there, hands in her lap, lips pressed so tight they looked vacuum-sealed. Daryl tried to offer her a napkin. She slapped it away. After the ceremony, the party rolled on. The bikers set up tables with food and drinks. Music blared from my porch. Neighbors I hadn't seen in months came by to shake my hand and say things like, "Way to put her in her place," and, "You should run for president of the neighborhood association." I laughed and waved them off. I wasn't after titles. I just wanted to be left alone to enjoy my land, my memories, and the occasional barbecue. At sunset, as the light filtered through the branches of the oak tree, one of the bikers came over to me. She was a woman in her 60s, with silver braids and a leather jacket covered in patches from places I'd only ever heard about. She handed me a cold beer and sat beside me on the steps. "Son, you did something good today," she said. "I mostly just made noise." "No," she replied, looking out at the people dancing. "You gave them permission to live. Even if just for a day." I didn't say anything. I just watched the bride laugh, barefoot on my lawn, and felt something settle inside me. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a grumpy old man fighting a losing battle. I felt like someone who had carved out a small island of freedom in a world made of plastic. And that was worth every goat's scream. The sun dipped behind the pines, and the wedding crowd slowly began to scatter, though laughter and clinking glasses still echoed across the yard. Children ran barefoot. Guests shared ribs with the bikers. And near my shed, two women, one in pearls, the other in leather, danced like they'd just remembered how. But peace, I knew well, was temporary. Cheryl wasn't finished. She never was. Behind that frozen smile and that helmet of hairspray was a woman plotting her greatest revenge yet. And it didn't take long before her schemes came roaring back. Around 7, just as Big Mike was beginning to tell the story of how he once outran a tornado on a Harley, a white truck with the neighborhood association's logo pulled up in front of my house like a declaration of war. Out stepped a guy named Marty Colton, a self-proclaimed compliance officer for the neighborhood association, wearing a tie too tight for the heat and wielding a clipboard like it was a badge of honor. He walked up the driveway, adjusting his glasses and trying to radiate authority but looking more like an accountant lost at a carnival. He cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Michel." I nodded from my rocking chair, a beer in hand, surrounded by 3 dogs, 2 bikers, and a karaoke machine someone had brought in a sidecar. Marty looked nervously around before taking a deep breath and reading from his clipboard. "This is an official notice from the Pine Valley Neighborhood Association. You are in violation of Section 14, Article B, for unauthorized gatherings without board approval. You are hereby fined $5,000 for non-compliance and for disrupting the neighborhood standards." I raised my eyebrows, leaned forward, and asked, "5,000? You want that written on a goat, or would you prefer a pig?" Marty blinked. "Excuse me." Before he could respond, Cheryl stormed in, Jake, hair back in place, blouse stained with spilled sangria, and fuming with rage. "This isn't funny, Jake. You humiliated me, humiliated my daughter, and you're going to pay for it." I stood up calmly, stretched my back, and walked right up to her. The crowd around us went quiet. Even the goats seemed to hold their breath. "I didn't humiliate anyone, Cheryl," I said. "You did that all on your own. You came into my yard without permission, threw a wedding on land that isn't yours, used my tree, my garden, my space, and didn't even ask. All I did was invite some friends to enjoy the view." She scoffed. "Don't pretend this was innocent. You planned this, engineered a hostile takeover of my event." I looked around, at the kids roasting marshmallows on a motorcycle exhaust pipe, at the barefoot bride spinning in the grass, at the retirees in folding chairs swapping stories with guys in sleeveless vests from the Reagan era. Looks to me like people are just having fun. Marty, visibly uncomfortable, tried to intervene. "Mr. Michel, regardless of your intent, the board has determined your gathering qualifies as a violation, and under the charter of the neighborhood association, we are authorized to issue fines and initiate foreclosure proceedings." I cut him off. "You sure about that?" He stammered, "Why yes, the wording is very clear." I turned around, went inside the house, and came back with a folder. I handed it to him. "That's my deed. Read it. Check the date. He opened it, frowning. 1973. Exactly, I said. This land was deeded to me by my grandfather, long before the Pine Valley Neighborhood Association ever existed. The property line ends right at the drainage ditch. Neither you nor your charter have jurisdiction over a single inch of this land. I'm not in the neighborhood association. Never was. I just never bothered to correct you all because I thought, what's the harm? Live and let live. But you crossed the line. Cheryl's face turned the color of a beet under the sun. That can't be. That land was annexed. There was a vote. A vote by people who don't own it, I replied calmly. And the county records back me up. I checked twice. Marty went pale. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and mumbled something about verifying with the legal department, backing away so fast I worried he'd trip over his clipboard. The crowd erupted in cheers. Someone popped another beer. The DJ, emboldened, cranked up "We're not gonna take it" and turned the volume all the way up. Cheryl didn't move. She just stood there, fists clenched, eyes darting like she was trying to rewind the entire day, but there was no going back. Her daughter was already slow dancing in the moonlight. Her son-in-law had ditched his tie and was playing horseshoes with a guy named Chainsaw Rick. And the authority of her precious neighborhood association had vanished like cotton candy in the rain. Finally, she turned and stormed toward her car, slamming the door so hard it made the street lamp flicker. As she sped off, I noticed she'd parked across 3 driveways, typical. With Cheryl out of the picture and the neighborhood association disarmed, the rest of the community let out a collective sigh. Tense shoulders relaxed. Whispered complaints vanished. People began to truly talk. Old resentments faded. Someone brought out a pie. Greg, the one from down the street who hadn't said more than 10 words to me in 5 years, came over and said, "Jake, that was the most fun I've had since my kids moved out." I smiled and clinked bottles with him. No joke. You should come around more often. Maybe next time we'll have a goat rodeo. He laughed. If you organize it, count me in. Later that night, when the grill's embers were nearly out and the last of the wedding guests had trickled away, I finally sat back down on the porch with Big Mike and Diesel, watching the stars blink above us. For the first time in a long while, I felt like my yard was truly mine again. Not just by law, but in spirit. It was alive. It had meaning again. Big Mike took a sip of whiskey and asked, "Ever thought of running for something? President of the Homeowners Association? Mayor? Local deity?" I shook my head. I don't need a title. I just need a yard I can call mine. He chuckled. Well, you've earned it. And I gotta say, you throw one hell of a party. I looked at the lawn, still trampled and sparkling with the last traces of glitter from Cheryl's failed decorations. It wasn't meant to be a party, I said. Just a reminder. A reminder of what? I leaned back in my chair, watching a goat climb onto the swing and gently sway. That some things can't be stolen. Not without consequences. When the sun rose the next morning, most of the chaos was gone, at least on the surface. The tents were gone. The chairs had vanished. The string quartet had quietly packed up sometime during the night, maybe still humming that rebellious version of "Here Comes the Bride." What remained was a yard full of footprints, a few beer bottles tucked among the flower beds, and the unmistakable feeling that something extraordinary had happened here. My walnut tree still stood majestic as ever, its swing swaying gently in the breeze, as if waving to the memory of a wedding that wasn't supposed to go like that, but somehow turned out exactly right. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee and took in the view. Everything smelled of charcoal and wildflowers. The grass was just beginning to forgive the abuse it had endured. Beside the shed, a few bikers still slept under a makeshift tarp, snoring like wintering bears. One of the goats, Freckles, the smallest spotted one, had climbed onto the porch and was gnawing the corner of a paper plate like it owed her money. I nudged her with the toe of my boot. "You had more fun than half the guests," I said. She stared back at me, unfazed. I didn't mind cleaning up. After years of caring for this land, I'd seen worse storms. Wild hogs. Even that one time a drone dropped a box of meatballs on my garden during a 4th of July parade. The important thing wasn't the mess. It was the change. The neighborhood had changed, quietly but unmistakably. The rigid lines drawn by the neighborhood association and their rulebook now felt more like suggestions. And it wasn't just me who stood up to Cheryl, it was all of us. The quiet neighbors. The ones who never took sides. The ones who always smiled politely but kept their heads down. Last night, we remembered we had a voice, and more importantly, options. Around noon, the neighbors began to arrive, uninvited, unannounced, but welcome all the same. Greg brought coffee and donuts. Sandra, who hadn't spoken to me since I put up a scarecrow she considered grotesquely aggressive, showed up with a broom and a casserole. Even old Whitaker, who once tried to fine me for leaving the hose uncoiled. He came limping over with a trash bag and a sheepish smile. At first, we didn't say much, we just started cleaning. A quiet, steady job between good neighbors. No meetings. No minutes. Just hands in the dirt, laughter in the air, and a shared idea that maybe the rules weren't really working for any of us. By mid-afternoon, the yard looked better than it had in months. Someone replanted the flower bed. Another fixed a broken piece of fence they'd been meaning to repair for a while. And right there, under the walnut tree where Cheryl's altar once stood, a monument to vanity, I dug a small hole and planted a young maple tree. I didn't make a speech or call anyone over. I just knelt down, packed the soil, and placed beside it a garden gnome, one my wife had painted years ago, its eyes chipped and its smile crooked. For a moment, all the commotion faded, and I just knelt there, my hand resting on the earth, feeling the roots settle into their new home. Then something unexpected happened. I was still brushing dirt from my pants when the roar of another motorcycle came from the end of the street, one I didn't recognize. It rolled into my driveway, a sleek silver machine with saddlebags and chrome so polished you could see your regrets reflected in it. The rider took off her helmet, and I blinked in surprise. It was Donna, the silver-braided biker who'd unleashed that operatic note last night that obliterated Cheryl's last shred of dignity. She smiled and walked toward me, holding a small envelope. "Got any plans next weekend?" she asked. "Depends," I said, taking it. "Are you fixing my carburetor or sabotaging another neighborhood association wedding?" "Neither," she said. "You're officiating mine." I laughed, thinking she was joking, but her eyes told me otherwise. "Seriously," she said. "Tess and I have been talking about getting married for years. And if anyone knows how to host a wedding with soul, it's you. Your yard's got better vibes than any chapel we've seen." I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten invitation that read simply, "Love, leather, and lemonade. Saturday at 5. Dress code, yourself." For the first time in years, I felt something shift in my chest, not just pride, not just rebellion, but connection. Purpose. I looked at the tree we'd just planted, then back at her. "It would be an honor," I said. And she rode off, kicking up dust and waving like a queen in a parade. I turned back toward the yard, that stubborn patch of land, that thorn in Cheryl's side, now something bigger than me. It had become a gathering place. A headquarters of rebellion. A sanctuary for those who still believed in being good neighbors without needing a rulebook to do it. And if that meant more goats, more barbecue stains, and the occasional wedding beneath the walnut tree, so be it. At sunset, just as I was folding up the last of the chairs, someone left a note. No envelope, just a single sheet folded and taped to my door. It was from Cheryl. The handwriting was tight and formal, like she'd written with a ruler beneath her hand. "Mr. Mitchell. Effective immediately, I resigned from my position as president of the Pine Valley Neighborhood Association due to personal stress and irreconcilable differences within the community. I believe it is in the best interest of the neighborhood that I step down. I will now focus on my own self-care and reflection. Sincerely, Cheryl Cranford." There was no apology. No acknowledgement. Just an exit. And yet, it was the sweetest note I'd ever received. I folded it carefully and placed it on the fridge, next to a photo of my wife holding a tomato bigger than her head. She always said I had a gift for making things grow. That night, I sat once more on the porch, rocking slowly as fireflies floated through the air. The goats slept in the shed. The swing creaked gently. The stars looked brighter, or maybe I just noticed them more. And for the first time in a long time, the world didn't feel so heavy. I hadn't really won anything. I hadn't claimed a title or taken a throne. All I did was stand my ground. But sometimes, that's all it takes, to remind people where the line is, and what happens when someone like Cheryl crosses it. Somewhere in the distance, the low hum of a motorcycle echoed. Maybe another guest. Maybe another story waiting to happen. I raised my glass toward the darkness and smiled. This yard was no longer just mine. It belonged to anyone with the courage to show up.